All right, let's dive right into this explainer. If you want to understand our world today, the borders, the alliances, the underlying international tensions, you really have to go back to the single most devastating conflict in human history. Almost all modern geopolitics trace their roots straight back to the crumbling cities and massive global shifts caused by World War II. But today, we're not just looking at the battles. We are going to map out exactly how this massive explosion of violence actually started, step by careful step. So how did a single peace agreement light the flame for the most devastating war in human history? It's a wild question, right? I mean, it's incredibly difficult to track down one single event that sparked a global conflict of this magnitude. But as we'll see today, it was actually a snowball effect, a series of very specific, compounding events that conspired together to eventually cause the globe to erupt in violence. And ironically enough, that flame was lit by an agreement that was meant to bring peace. The crucial starting point here is Article 231, also known as the War Guilt Clause, from the 1919 Treaty of Versailles. This was signed right at the end of World War I. Now, France and Britain, they wanted to punish Germany heavily for the war and recover their own massive losses, so they baked in this clause. It essentially forced Germany to accept total, absolute responsibility for all the losses of the First World War, completely regardless of the other participating countries. And the punishment? A staggering fine of $33 billion. To put that into perspective, in today's money, you're looking at around $270 billion. Now, to really wrap your head around the sheer weight of this financial burden, just consider this absolutely shocking number, 2010. The weight of this treaty was so impossibly heavy that Germany didn't actually make the final payment on this debt until the year 2010. Literally, it took them almost an entire century to pay the whole thing off. And you have to ask yourself, where does that money actually come from? It comes from the citizens, and the immediate fallout for those people was just absolutely catastrophic. Let's look at the reality on the ground for a second. Germany made its first payment in 1921, and almost immediately, their currency, the German mark, went into an absolute freefall of hyperinflation. Imagine this, in Berlin, in the year 1922, a simple basic packet of bread cost 160 marks. But watch how fast this snowballs. Just 1 year later, in 1923, that exact same packet of bread cost 200 billion marks. 200 billion! The currency was devalued so rapidly that the economy was just completely crippled. Unemployment skyrocketed out of control, people were desperate, kids were starving, and the entire nation was basically drowning in international humiliation. And historically speaking, when a nation is that desperate and vulnerable, well, it leaves the door wide open for manipulation. Which brings us to Hitler's rise to power and how he exploited a desperate nation. Capitalizing on all of this economic despair, a young political leader named Adolf Hitler manipulated his way into absolute control. He actually survived a failed coup in 1923, which wildly ended up massively increasing his popularity, and then the devastating Great Depression hit in 1929, leaving 6 million Germans unemployed. The public was absolutely desperate for a savior. So by 1933, Hitler became the absolute dictator of Germany. Once he was in power, he started aggressively pushing this dark ideological vision. He wanted to build a racially pure empire exclusively for what he called the Aryan race. And to justify this, he pushed a dangerous conspiracy theory known as Judeo-Bolshevism, falsely blaming Jews and socialists for Germany's disgrace. But to build this massive empire, he needed resources and he needed territory. He called it Lebensraum, or living space, and he was fully prepared to conquer neighboring nations to get it. So you might be wondering, how did the rest of the world react? Well, in 1935, Germany openly revealed they had secretly built an air force. This was a blatant, unapologetic violation of the Treaty of Versailles, which explicitly forbade Germany from having a military. But surprisingly, a lot of folks in Britain actually sympathized with Germany. They kind of felt the original treaty had been way too harsh. They even signed a naval agreement allowing Hitler to build up a navy. France, on the other hand, was totally panicked by this militarization and desperately started building a 450-kilometer-long defensive wall right on their border, known as the Maginot Line. Emboldened by Britain's leniency, Hitler kicked off his expansion, and the timeline of these bloodless conquests brilliantly illustrates the snowball of aggression gathering momentum. In February 1938, he targeted Austria, forcing them to infiltrate their government with pro-Nazi officials. When the Austrian chancellor tried to hold a public vote on independence in March, Hitler simply marched his army right into Vienna. The chancellor resigned to avoid a bloodbath, and boom, Austria was absorbed. Next up, in September 1938, Hitler demanded the Sudetenland, a border region of Czechoslovakia filled with 3 million German speakers. He just claimed it as German territory. And without facing major military pushback, by March 1939, he launched a complete invasion of Czechoslovakia. Now, this brings us to a really critical moment of appeasement. British Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain desperately wanted to avoid another world war. He naively believed that if he just gave Hitler what he wanted, Hitler would eventually be satisfied. There are larger settlements in which all Europe may find peace, he said. So in September 1938, they signed the Munich Agreement, essentially handing over the Sudetenland in exchange for Hitler's promise of no more wars. Chamberlain flew home, proudly declaring he had secured peace for Europe. But, as we know, Hitler immediately violated that agreement and invaded the rest of Czechoslovakia anyway. With Czechoslovakia handled, Hitler turned his eyes to his next target, Poland. But to pull this off, he executed a stunning piece of strategic irony. You see, on one side, Hitler absolutely despised the Soviet Union and communist ideology. Yet on the other side, in 1939, he signed a secret mutual agreement with them. Why in the world would he do that? Because both Hitler and the Soviet leader, Joseph Stalin, wanted a piece of Poland. So, Hitler temporarily shoved his deep ideological hatred to the side just to secure a strategic alliance, one that would let him invade and carve up Poland without Soviet interference. Which brings us to the ignition point. The invasion of Poland. On September 1, 1939, the patience of the world finally snapped. Nearly 1 million German troops mobilized and stormed into Poland from the north and the south. The UK gave Hitler a very strict ultimatum to withdraw. When he ignored it, the UK, followed quickly by France and their allies, officially declared war on Germany. The world watched in absolute horror as Hitler unleashed a revolutionary warfare strategy called Blitzkrieg, or lightning war. Blitzkrieg relied on extreme speed and stealth. Tanks would punch through defenses way faster than the enemy could react, followed instantly by overwhelming attacks from the German Air Force, the Luftwaffe. It was designed to literally wrap up a war in less than a week. And against Poland's old-fashioned army, which was literally still using horse-mounted cavalry, it was utterly defenseless. Now here is a truly wild, surprising detail about how they maintained this terrifying speed. The German troops were heavily issued a drug called Pervitin. Today, we know this drug as crystal meth. By feeding their soldiers meth, the German military could suppress their troops' hunger, completely eliminate their need for sleep, and artificially boost their confidence. So while defending armies naturally had to stop and rest at night, the drug-fueled Nazi army could just fight continuously, conquering territory at a totally unnatural, breakneck pace. Yet, despite declaring war, the Allies' initial response was, well, it was incredibly tragic. We actually call this period the phony war. Because on one side, you have Britain, France, and their allies officially declaring war on Germany. But on the ground, none of these countries provided any actual military support to save Poland. They essentially just sat back and watched as Poland fell in under a week. Shortly after, the Soviet Union invaded from the other side, and the two totalitarian powers partitioned Poland right down the middle while the Allies did practically nothing. And while Hitler was busy looking west, Stalin was quietly securing his own borders. Stalin knew the Soviet city of Leningrad was uncomfortably close to the border of Finland. So, to keep enemy forces away and created a buffer zone, the Soviet Union invaded Finland. Now, despite having a much smaller army, the Finns put up a fierce fight, but ultimately sheer numbers won out. And in March 1940, the Moscow Peace Treaty forced Finland to hand over 11% of its land to the Soviets. Now we enter the lightning strike, as Western Europe rapidly falls. The quiet in the West violently shattered as that fueled, battle-tested German war machine turned its terrifying momentum straight toward France and Britain. The phony war was officially over, and the collapse of Western Europe happened at an unstoppable speed. In April 1940, Hitler's forces easily overwhelmed Norway and Denmark via Blitzkrieg invasions. The failures were so massive that British Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain was forced to resign on May 10th, handing power over to Winston Churchill. On that exact same day, Germany launched an all-out attack on France, Belgium, and the Netherlands. By June 22nd, just over a month later, France completely surrendered. Hitler's forces seemed practically invincible in the spring of 1940. So, how exactly did France fall so quickly? It all came down to a brilliantly devastating military maneuver. Remember that massive French defensive wall, the Maginot Line? The Nazis completely outsmarted them, and bypassed it. They divided their forces into 3 steps. Step 1, Group B attacks the Netherlands to draw Allied troops north. Step 2, Group C distracts the French troops at the Maginot Line, basically a noisy diversion. Meanwhile, Step 3, Group A secretly navigates 40,000 military vehicles straight through the Ardennes forest. French experts thought this thick forest was utterly impenetrable for tanks. They were dead wrong. The Germans slipped right through, captured the city of Sedan, and attacked the Allied forces from behind, trapping them. This trap led to one of the most miraculous evacuations of the entire war. With the German army closing in, hundreds of thousands of British and French soldiers were pushed all the way back to the sea, stranded on the beaches of Dunkirk. Facing total annihilation, Winston Churchill launched Operation Dynamo. Using a combination of British Royal Air Force cover, Navy ships, and hundreds of private civilian fishing boats, they miraculously managed to evacuate a staggering 350,000 soldiers across the sea. It saved the Allied army from total destruction. With France fallen, and Italy officially joining forces with Germany as part of the Axis powers, Britain was left entirely alone. It was in this incredibly dark hour that Churchill delivered his legendary address, firmly cementing the shift from Chamberlain's weak appeasement to absolute fierce defiance. He declared to the world, "We shall fight on the beaches. We shall fight on the landing grounds. We shall never surrender." And that leaves us here, at a truly chilling point in history. By July 1940, Hitler essentially controlled all of Western Europe. His only remaining active enemy was a battered, solitary Britain. Meanwhile, across the ocean, America was standing firmly on the sidelines, refusing to get involved in Europe's war. Hitler had a massive, overwhelming upper hand, which leaves us with a really powerful, lingering question. With Europe crushed and the Nazi war machine seemingly unstoppable, how in the world could the Allies possibly recover and turn the tide from such a catastrophic beginning? Well, that, my friends, is a story for another explainer. Thanks for joining.